Hey team, Jack Delosa here, founder of The Entourage, and welcome to this episode of the Make It Happen show. Over the last 12 months, business owners everywhere have had quite a challenging journey in navigating the uncertainty of everything that's been going on in the world. For our 11th birthday here at The Entourage, we wanted to do something about that. We've created a resource center where everything you need, regardless of what stage of business you are at, is in this resource center, whether it's short courses, ebooks for how do you start, how do you grow, how do you scale beyond yourself, how do you build an organization that's scalable and sustainable that can grow beyond you. It is all there. Simply head to www.the-entourage.com/resources to access everything you need from the world's best entrepreneurs to start growing faster now. Let's get into the Make It Happen show.
24 years old in $80,000 debt, and you don't really see the forest for the trees. So my entire thought process then was, I need to get out of it. I need this debt off my heart and off my shoulders because it was weighing on me heavily. If creativity is our lifeblood, why are we not harnessing and nurturing every element of that in ourselves? To me, I was like, I don't have time for a hobby right now. I'm running a multi-million-dollar business, which is the dumbest business move because it's like you should be nurturing that. Anyone can replicate your product. They can replicate your packaging. They cannot replicate your story.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of the Make It Happen show. I'm Tim Morris, the CEO here at The Entourage, and today we're joined by Samantha Wills. Samantha was the founder of the cult brand Samantha Wills Jewellery. She's also the author of the book of Gold and Dust. In this episode, we really dive deep into what it means to be a creative entrepreneur. How to identify what your strengths are, and also importantly, how to identify what you're not so strong at and build a team around that. We also talk about how you make the tough decisions, in Samantha's case, the toughest decision when your creativity runs out. So if you're a creative entrepreneur, if you like to make something out of nothing, or you work with one, this is definitely an episode not to miss. Let's get into it. Today, I'm joined by Samantha Wills. Samantha, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
It's great to have you on. It's great to have you here. It's pretty rare that we have people in the studio.
It is indeed. Well, thank you.
That's all right. So you are or were the founder of your brand, Samantha Wills Jewellery, which was built up into a cult following. You grew it over a number of years.
Yep.
And then you made the difficult decision to close it down, really at the height of its success. I mean, how and why did you make that happen?
Well, I started the brand, on my dining room table when I was 21 years old, and then, we had it for 15 years. So around, I would say probably the 13-year mark, as a creative person, I thrive on, new ideas and inspiration. That's the lifeblood of any creative. And, by that point, I had designed 11,000 pieces of jewellery. So, the little flicker in my soul that, loved doing that, I could feel it starting to dim a little bit. And, 11,000 pieces of jewellery, and it's like, all right, well, it's just a creative block. Like I'm pretty familiar with that over the time. I was like, I'll just write it out. And 6 months in, another 6 months, year and a half in, I'm like, okay, hang on, this is not going anywhere.
That's huge volume. That's like almost 1,000 pieces a year.
Yeah.
Is that a high volume for any designer?
I think, over time, so I started, in 2004 doing probably 3 collections a year, and they were maybe 50 pieces per collection. Then the bigger the brand got, the more, it turns into a logistics company when you're designing, David Jones, like, hey, here's our matrix. We need, X amount at this price point. We need this, da-da-da. So I don't, to be honest, I'm not sure about how it would sit in other companies, but I know it, we're releasing 25 collections a year at one point.
And the most important thing is for you, it felt like it was too much. It felt like you'd been producing a lot over a long time.
Yeah, well, I think, as a creative, you design with the heart, but it got to the point where I was designing with my hands and my heart didn't have a lot to do with it by that point. So, I thought I was in the position to be like, I just need to get this creativity back. Like, I need to find a way. So I, at the time went up to an upstate, I was living in New York, went up to an upstate retreat there, and I was like, I just need a week to try and, get my shit back together really and get that passion back. And it was there that I had the idea the idea reached me. It was the biggest decision I've ever made, but it was the calmest. And I just had this very moment of clarity where it's like, it's time to close. Hadn't even been on my radar. I didn't even, I ever so modestly had named the brand after myself. The brand was in trajectory and growth. I'm like, there's no logic to that. So I really sat with that for, the idea came to me and I was like, hang on, this is a big deal. This affects a lot more people than myself. And I sat with it for 2 weeks, and every morning I would wake up and ask myself how I felt about it, not what I thought about it, but how I felt. And I think, you know, our feeling filter, you can't fake a feeling, right? But you can talk yourself out of something.
Yeah.
So that's how I came to that decision.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, the key thread that I take through that and through your book is the creativity element. And you're a creative entrepreneur, and you just, that sense of creativity was gone. And you're right, it doesn't just come back because you take a break.
Right.
And so many entrepreneurs that we see, so many entrepreneurs end up with a business because they are creative.
Right.
They're really good at something. They bring something out of nothing, but then that slowly gets kind of almost dragged out of them as the business grows. Well,
it usually starts as your hobby, right?
Yeah.
And so then you almost like bastardize it. No, and don't get me wrong, like my journey has been the best thing that's ever happened. It's been incredible. But I think as creators, we don't replace that hobby often. So we then turn into creative founders, and then we start to monetize it, and it just gets bigger, you know, God willing, gets bigger and bigger. But we don't have time to replace the creative hobby. And I think that's a real problem for creatives, yeah.
And so could that potentially be one way for a creative founder to keep a spark of creativity? If what is originally their hobby becomes their business and it becomes commercial, do they need to make sure they have other things that light themselves up outside of that?
I think so. I think that's something I didn't do. I was like, I'm far too busy, and, you know, really, you know, if creativity is our lifeblood, why are we not harnessing and nurturing every element of that in ourselves? To me, I was like, I don't have time for a hobby right now. You know, I'm running a multi-million-dollar business, which is the dumbest business move, because it's like you should be nurturing that. So yeah I would say it's paramount. Because
so many founders are creative founders, or somewhere on the creativity spectrum, you know, because to bring a business out of nothing, you have to be creative. That just by its very definition. Right. But also you do see far more founders who are more focused on dynamics, creativity, innovation than on the details. What are some other ideas that you have to keep on fostering that creativity, to protect the creative as the business grows underneath them?
I think surrounding yourself with people who are good at the things you aren't. I think, you know, when you're in that startup mode, like my first 3 years, I did everything myself. You know, being 20, 21, 22, 23, I didn't really know how to run a business.
You also don't really have any other option at that stage.
No, absolutely. I couldn't see out. I was like a field mouse. Like you just see the blades of grass. You're like, I don't know how to get out of this thing. And, you know, it's to me, it was like spending money. So, you know, getting, whether it's a contract person or an employee, like it was such a big deal to me in those first startup phases. But I look back on it now and I'm like, no, that would have been an investment for me to, like, there's no way I should have been running the accounting at 21 years old as a creative person. Like, that's just silly. But I gave it a go, right? So I think looking at it differently and really valuing your time and your output and obviously I think, you know, when you look over the journey from startup, you kind of move through phases because financially you're not able to, you know, put in a CEO at, you know, in your first 2 years, whatever. So I think, you know, I look at it and you kind of, in that first few years, you're looking for a jack of all trades, someone who just kind of is like, yep, I can sit across your, you know, marketing and also your warehousing and kind of thing. Then once you get a little bit bigger, you're like, all right, let's start to put, you know, specialist kind of managers in across different departments. And then you keep growing. And then by the time you're at, you know, kind of running on a well-oiled machine, that's when you start getting people at best of industry. So it is a journey. So it's being really realistic about that too.
Yeah. There are a couple of ways you could slice it. I agree. Generalist first, unless potentially before that you could do like freelance or part-time specialists.
Totally,
but again, that's like knowing what you don't know or knowing what you're not good at. Like the accounting example that you used before, it's like, even in the first couple of years, you still got to get your numbers right, and you've got to worry about the ATO and paying tax.
Absolutely.
So maybe starting up with just get someone part-time to help you with that.
Yep.
And then as the business actually starts growing, you get a proper business.
Totally.
Then look for generalists. So can you remember who your first generalist was that you brought on?
It was a girl called Misha. She was one of my very first employees. And, you know, the story that I share in the book is of the fake employee that I made up. So, you know, I don't recommend that. I feel like enough time has passed where I can't go to jail for sharing that story. But, you know, I was doing everything myself, and I was, you know, making the collection, going in and selling it. And then, you know, when you, the worst thing for a sales relationship is like, hey, you owe me money. So I was like, I need an accounts receivable person. I was like, I need a bad cop to my good cop.
Yeah.
So I was like, I'm just going to make up a fake email address. I was like, all right, Renee@SamanthaWills.com got an email. And, you know, you're working till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, every morning in those very early startup days. And so I, you know, one morning at 1 o'clock in the morning, I was like, all right, well, you know, Samantha, emailed out to our retailers and be like, oh, Renee in CC, she's going to be your new point person for, accounts
watch out
receivable.
for Renee.
Yeah,
she's going to be very
she's
hard.
a savage. So then Renee starts like emailing out to all our customers and got the cash flow moving. So it's like, okay, this is great. I can then focus on, manufacturing, design, sales. And it was all well and good till someone called to speak to her. And I'm like, well, okay. So I put on this like different voice on the
Hello,
phone.
Renee.
Renee speaking, accounts department. But and then retailers are then messaging me going, that Renee girl, she's diligent, isn't she? She's working all hours of the day. I was like, she's a very hard worker. So I share that story because I think it is all too real in those startup phases where for some reason I think we're trained that spending money is spending money, not investing money.
Yeah.
It's an investment in your business to have good people in what capacity that can be.
Well, think about what you could have been doing if you weren't having to be Renee.
Totally.
Yeah,
totally.
But the principle of having a Renee, like someone that's not you, or someone that can take a different tact and doesn't have to pretend to be you, is very, very important.
Yes.
And so figuring out how to get that person on or people in that role as early as possible is super important.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think if you think of the tradition of creativity, it's almost like that's a hobby. And even I used the word before, it's a hobby that you turn, you commercialize. But I think there's still some stigma in our minds somewhere that it's like, well, if I'm sitting there designing, even though that's the lifeblood of the business, the real work is, the right side, the left side brain of, the logistics of it. So it's still, it's like, hey, we need to nurture that creativity in a way that allows the creative or creatives in the business to continue producing. In my case, if I stop designing jewellery, the whole company ceases, but that often I was like, oh God, I've got to get that new collection out because that was the fun bit. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
So after the fake Renee and the real Misha, who came along the journey after that?
So we had, I would just bring on kind of more generalists. So I had 3 girls with me. And then when I met my business partner who, was very much the business mind behind things and I was the creative, he then put in a general manager and she'd come out of a sales background. So, and again, we wouldn't hire a sales background general manager 10 years in, but at that time it's like, all right, well, it's more a sales director role. And then, as it grows into a GM role.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the right way to go at that stage, actually, because you do need, no matter how great the product is or the service and how creative it is, you do need people out there selling it. Otherwise that revenue doesn't flow through. And so having a sales focused team in the early days is very important.
And, specifically at that time, so it was around 2008, it was a wholesale focused person, whereas now I would hire a digital sales focused person. So it's looking at where your business is and what direction you're taking it and looking for a specialist specifically in that area. As a generalist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. So you talk about your business partner a lot in the book, Jeff. And so how did that relationship come about? And then I'm really interested in how you guys worked well together, because you clearly did work very well together, but your key take on that.
Yes. So I met him through a colleague I used to work with when I had a real retail 9-to-5 job. And Todd was his name, and he called me up and he said, they were running a surf jewelry business at the time, so we need a women's jewelry range. Would you come and meet our, new owner of the business? So I flew up to talk to them about doing a contract design role and met Jeff and kind of, he's like, so tell me about this Samantha Wills Jewellery business you got going on. I was like, took him through the whole thing. And at this point I was in $80,000 worth of debt.
Did you tell him that in the first meeting? Or?
Well, I kind of was like, 79,995 just to take the sting off it. And at that time I'd also met another gentleman who had daughters about my age, and I was looking for an investor because at this point the bank wouldn't give me any more money. I had 5 maxed out credit cards. And so I met with this other investor, and he's like, I really like what you do. You seem like you're a very hard worker. I like your story. I'd love to invest. I can clear your debt, and, I'll send over this 1-page contract for you to have a look over. Let's meet up the following Friday. And that contract essentially said, for my $80,000 investment, I want 51% of the Samantha Wills brand. And at that time, and 24 years old in $80,000 debt, and you don't really see the forest for the trees. So my entire thought process then was, I need to get out of it. I need this debt off my heart and off my shoulders because it was weighing on me heavily. And in the interim, my ex-colleague rang. I went up and met Jeff, was telling Jeff about the business. And I said, but I found this investor, not to worry, I'm going to be debt-free by, next week. And he's like, well, what does he want in return for his investment? And I said, he only wants 51%. And he we're at this tiny little cafe up in Ballina where the warehouse was. And he almost choked on his chicken sandwich when I said that. And he kind of got it down. He's like, if you sign that document, it'll be the fucking dumbest thing you ever do in your life. And it was that moment that kind of like brought me back, because I think when you're in that turmoil, right, like when you're doing everything and it's so overwhelming, and just kind of that reality check of long-term rather than reactionary.
And what a bit of advice to get, because that is very aggressive terms.
Oh,
as 24 though, you're probably like, you don't see quite what it is.
No, I didn't at all. And so anyway, I ripped the contract up, and I took the contract role with his company, and which meant I was in his office every Friday, up in Ballina. I'd fly from Sydney to Ballina every Friday, work with their design team, and then I'd be like, what about you? Will you come on board in my business? I need a business partner. I said, I don't want a cent from you. I just want your business mind in my company. He's like, no. I asked him 14 times, and on the 15th time, he said, oh my God, I'll think about it. And I said, I'll take that as a yes, and I signed over 30% equity. And for the 11 years that followed that we're in business, we didn't have one loss-making year since, and we didn't put an external cent of money in.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic. But you talk about crossroads. That was a crossroads for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, it is about finding, I'm very much in the creative brain. And so I needed someone that was in the logistic brain. And then how do we find a way to meet at that point?
Yeah. Well, and that's a lot harder done than said. Right?
Absolutely.
Because you do... we call dynamics and mechanics, creative logistics.
Yep.
Having that pairing, it's so important to a lot of businesses, but it's hard to get right. And so what do you think were some of the secrets for you guys working well together and finding common ground?
Well, I think even before you meet that person, I think meeting that person is hard, person or persons. And I think for so long, and it might be a female thing, but we don't like to share when we need help. And so I think we do this closed networking rather than, at that point I was at the end of the line. So I was telling anyone who would listen, like, does anyone know anyone? I'll take any meeting. So I think firstly telling people what you need and asking people to tap into their networks as well. And then it has to be a feeling when you meet the person, like it can't be, like that original story I shared where I'm like, I just need to get out of debt. It has to be about the feeling of, especially if it's your creative journey, like, is this person going to help you nurture it? Is it just a money grab? Is it are they? And so often I think a lot of people on the, the business and P&L side, really clash with the marketing and creative side, because they're like, you guys are just spending all the money, and it's usually quite a volatile relationship. So finding someone who understands brand, who understands that brand requires investment, and what the heart and soul of that means, and finding, the business side of that respects that, I think, first and foremost. And then I think, working together, it's give and take. Like, it's, as a creative person, you're very passionate and you take things quite personally a lot of the time. And I think if you can remove that like, nothing's personal. It really, we make it personal, but I don't think many things are as personal. So, removing that and then coming together in a, meeting halfway.
Yeah. Actually, so I agree with you on all of that, almost from the other side, because so we have our founder, Jack Delosa, who's the creative in our relationship, and I'm far more from the logistical business side of things.
Right.
But it's the same thing from the other side as well. The logistical people will just be as passionate about their ideas or thoughts on how it should go.
Yep.
And so it's about saying to yourself, well, it's not about one winning. It's about combining the two,
Absolutely.
recognizing the other side, and then what comes out of that will be stronger.
Yes.
But you do have to, you've got to think through that. You've got to put it down.
You got to think, and you got to arm wrestle sometimes, and it's often hard. And I often say, you have to decide as a creative if you want to sit in that commercial creative space. Like if you want to be an artist and you're all pure about your art, that's all well and good, but that's like, that's on one end of the scale. I'm like, you need that business and logistical back then, and the other way as well. Like if you're just a logistical, business side of things, you need a brand entity around that, because brand is where the loyalty comes from. So it's one hand needs the other. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so maybe the main takeaway just from this part of the convo is that, for any founder out there or any entrepreneur, like have a think about, what are your strengths? Maybe, what side of the spectrum are you on? You're on the dynamics or the mechanics, the creative or the logistics. Have a think about where you are, because while the majority, I think, are on the creative side, certainly not all.
Yeah.
Have a think about where you are, and then think about, all right, who would complement me?
Absolutely.
Who would be able to do the things that frankly drive me crazy?
Yep.
And then go out and try and find them, because I think an important part is, and you just must have, you were lucky enough to have this with Jeff. I'm certainly lucky enough to have it with Jack. Is that there's got to just be an instant personal trust and connection.
Absolutely. And also removing the ego of it. When you feel like, well, I think I should be doing that. It's like, well, is that your strength though? Like, are they better at it? So, moving ego out of the way and making those decisions.
Yeah. So for you, what are the areas that are definitely not your strengths or not your highest and best use?
Definitely, I had to learn the P&L. I had to learn how to run a P&L. Even now, I know how to do it, but I wouldn't say that that's my strength.
Don't want to spend your Saturday evening doing it?
I don't know. I understand that I upset some accountants out there, but I apologise. Anything around, like I'm big picture. My attention to detail is not ideal. It is in a branding kind of marketing sense, but in a logistics sense, it's not my language.
Yeah.
So
I find a lot of creative or dynamic focused entrepreneurs, their attention to detail can be huge for a very short period of time.
Yes.
So you can look at any part of your business and go, this area needs attention right now, and you can get right in. But generally it's for a couple of weeks to maybe a couple of months on the outside.
Weeks, I think, yeah.
you're
like,
hours.
Yeah.
So I think that's important. And so what were some of the things that then enabled you to do? Finding someone that could start to pay attention to the areas of the business that weren't your love or where you wanted to spend your time. What did that then free you up to do?
Well, I think all creatives are different. Like you might find a creative who loves, I don't know, seeing how the warehouse works. Like it's not to say that just because you're creative, you're not going to like that side of the business. So treating every, and especially if it's a creative founder, like it's their vision, it's their dream. And it's such a gracious act for people to come in and work with, especially an active creative founder, because you're essentially coming in, building someone else's dream. So it's an act of grace, I believe. It allowed me very much just to invest time in creativity, and the creativity always kind of came very easily to me, but to really look forward. And I think when you're, as a creative founder and working in that senior management with your team, you need to be looking, 2.5 years forward. Even in the design timeline for me, it was a year in advance. But when you're planning that forward creatively, it needs to be, looking there. You're not reactive. It's all proactive.
Yeah. Well, because if you don't look far enough forwards, then you still need to do the thinking, do the changes, do the new product lines, you do everything. And if you're not planning far enough in advance, then the business itself just gets a lot of whiplash. You're not feeling that pipeline. People are stressed because then you're like, hey, we need this now, where it's because it starts at the top, right? If you're not organised. And the timelines on those things are long and the second round development and things. So it allowed me to have creative integrity, but with planning. And usually those, to a creative, planning's a bit of a dirty word, and it's kind of stifles the process, but it's so needed, so important. And you were exercising that creativity not just in the products that you're bringing out, but in the brand itself, in the community, and also then in your international expansion. And so how did your ability to invest more time and effort into those areas evolve?
I think the most powerful one in that is community. I think, I often say anyone can replicate your product, they can replicate your packaging, they cannot replicate your story. So if you're telling a story well, you're telling it authentically, that's where community starts to come in. And, in I say the olden days, but before kind of the internet, you'd look at it, the brand was the hierarchy, right? So the brand would be like traditional advertising. We tell the consumer what they're going to wear or whatever your industry is. Like we advertise them and we tell them this is what it's going to be this season. Then the digital landscape kind of flattened that. So you couldn't charge X prices in one market and another price in another market, because it made it quite transparent and flattened it. Then you add to that social media, and it gave personality, and it gave human connection, and it gave the opportunity for vulnerability. So then when you start, like it used to be brand talking to customer, then the customer started talking with the brand back and forth. You add vulnerability to that, that's where community is kind of formed. And I think for us, it was such an incredibly loyal community, but we were constantly working to engage them and delight them and surprise them. One story that I share in the book is about being on my couch on one Sunday afternoon. My phone started to ping, and we used to have this ring called the Bohemian Bardo ring, which was our number one bestseller. It was worn by Eva Mendes in 2008, never left the top of our bestsellers list. We moved nearly 1 million of them through our business in 10 years. And so people would collect this ring. Like it was like it had its own cult status of its own. And so my phone started to ping one day, one Sunday afternoon, and it was some of our most engaged customers being like, oh, why don't we post what colour we want to see the next Bohemian Bardot in? Let's tag Samantha and show her. And so I saw this and I'm like, oh, hey guys, like in conversation, not talking to them, talking with them.
Yeah.
Hey guys, like amazing. Make sure you tell us like what you'd like to name the colour as well, because, we're running out of colour names kind of thing. And then my phone just started to light up. So at this, 5 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, was in conversation with our highest engaged consumer, which is also reflective of our highest spend consumer, telling me what they wanted to buy in our best-selling product. So I went to our production houses the next day with a mood board of all these colours. It was the quickest and most successful commercial turnaround we've ever done. And I'm like, that's about community. That had nothing to do with me as a designer.
Although you also embraced it, right? Some people could be like, wait, don't you tell us what we should be coming out with? And you're like, no.
I'm like, talk with your consumer, not to her, is a huge difference in that.
Yeah. And then so the move over to the States, right? When did that start becoming an idea that you wanted to pursue? And then what were the main milestones along that journey?
For me, it was around, so we started in 2008 getting a lot of celebrity placements. So Eva Mendes, Pink was out here. We were sending a lot of product to the States for celebrity services out of there. And then in 2010, we had product on Sex and the City, the second film, which is an absolutely shit, awful film for anyone who has seen it. It is so bad. But for us, it was such a brilliant brand partnership because I think, from the celebrity element.
It's probably a good thing the business isn't still in partnership with them at the moment.
Oh my God, anyone who's seen it will know exactly what I mean. It's so bad. But, Sex and the City as a brand, as a business move for us, the celebrity aside, that put us on a global stage that just money couldn't buy. So it was really clear we needed someone in the States, and Jeff was like, hey, no one knows the brand like you need to go over there and spend time there. And I think, I think there's this concept of like, let's go conquer the American market, and you get over there, you're like, oh, okay, the American market's like literally like 5 different countries. Like it's a huge market. It's not a market that you can dip your toe in and just see how it goes. If you want that market to commit to you, you have to commit to it. So, I made the move over, and it was hard. It was like, even the word jewellery, we spoke English is both our first language, but the word jewellery is spelt differently, which sounds like a minor thing, but it's really the undertone of how difficult that market is to navigate. So went over there. I made a really big mistake by trying to change the authenticity of our brand to try and fit a market I thought that we should be in over there. It did not go well.
I wonder why, because that was a very interesting story, and I wonder why it didn't quite gel, because you'd think that like a new country, they don't know the old brand story, coming up with a new brand story, they shouldn't pick up on the inauthenticity, but they did.
Well, I think an inauthenticity is you can smell it, like it just didn't make. You can't sell something that's, I don't know. It was so bad, and not only did it not pick up in America, it also isolated, the engagement that we had in Australia. And I share this quite honestly in the book. I'm like, I could have bankrupted us in one season. Like it was my biggest mistake in business.
And so, fortunately, you recognise it, turn it around. How did you recognise it? The reception was so poor.
So bad,
Couldn't help but recognise it.
Biggest black eye, and at that point, you're not just seeing a downturn in sales, from online, like your direct channel. Retailers, the brand was in such growth. The retailers are like, if Samantha thinks we're doing this season, we're going to double our budget from last season. So retailers are left with a black eye. It's just a mess. So I found myself sitting there, in this demolition site of what I'd done to the brand, and it was really having to go back to the girl at the Bondi Markets table and, sitting at her dining table, like, why did we start this in the first place? And going back to that why and honouring where we had come from, because when I put the detonation under it, I was like, well, no one in New York, no one knows where Bondi Markets are. No one cares that, the girl started on a dining room table. Like all this relativity that people had connected with because it was so human. I stripped it out completely. So going back to that and honouring where we came from, but still moving the brand forward and evolving it.
Hey team, Jack again. Just another invitation to make sure you're jumping into our resource centre to be guided by the world's best entrepreneurs for how you can grow and scale great companies. Head to www.the-entourage.com/resources to make it happen. Now, let's get back into the show.
What would be one or two other lessons you learned from the American market? Because for so many, Australian entrepreneurs, that is an aspiration. Like you get over, maybe somehow get into the market, not dominate the market. But so what were some of the lessons that you've learned or advice you could give?
It's not one big country. Like if you're like, all right, we're going for the East Coast market, then that's a country. It's very different to the West Coast. South, it's, I've heard of brands going over there in fashion and being like, all right, we're going to release our main collections to the outer coast. Then the collection we did last year will go in a few states and do that. And so they're almost selling 5 different collections because the market's so different. Definitely if you want that market to commit to you, you have to commit to it. It's, Australia is a really long way away from there. And if you jump on a plane, a few times a year, it's not enough.
Yeah.
I think warehousing over there is really important because I think the mentality is that, and I understand it, you don't want to be paying international shipping.
No.
If you want to call a customer service team, you don't want to, are they awake? What time is Australia? Like it's such an insular focus that you have to go to their language.
Well, and there's also no country in the world where expectations are higher.
Absolutely.
Everything should be same day or next day delivery and that's it.
Definitely.
If you're shipping from Australia, that's just not going to happen.
3PL, so third party logistics over there. It's not just like, you put all your stuff in a warehouse, you're paying rent on every item that's there. And the longer it sits there, you're paying for every tag, you're paying for every return. Like it's a behemoth of a decision to try and tackle that market.
So to maybe chunk it down a little bit, would you recommend just picking one of those 5 sub-markets first?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. I would question why you want to go to the States in the first place. I think it's such a romantic, lofty ideal, and it was mine. I'm not saying don't do it. And it's really hard. And I think that get your establishment here and make your mistakes in your home market. Because they're much more forgiving. So if you go over there, you need to have your shit together. And I would definitely be doing a like you said, smaller market and testing where that is for you.
I do encourage a lot of business owners to look at Southeast Asia.
Yep.
Particularly if you want to expand. I mean, Australia is held in such high regard
Absolutely.
in this region, but oftentimes we kind of skip it and we want to go to America or we want to go to one of the other big 6 English-speaking nations. But Southeast Asia, particularly for service-based businesses, but even product as well.
Yeah, but also looking at your numbers, like look, even on your social numbers, like where is your audience? If it's just an ego thing to be like, I want America, it's like, does that even logistically make sense?
For us, whenever we do anything with any international reach, like our online programs, Singapore is always our second biggest country. But I wouldn't have thought it without looking at the numbers. Yeah. So let's but you did have a lot of great success in the States. In fact, you had a whole 15 years of great success, and then you started getting to the point where it wasn't a creeping thought. You had a realization one day that the business needed to close down, right? Can you just dive into that in a little bit more detail? I know we touched on it, but it's just so interesting, and it will be for so many people listening.
So I think the brand over, I guess, the course of 15 years, had so many hands touch it. It even though it was my name, it far eclipsed. If it was just me, it'd still be on my dining table. So it had so many, and predominantly women throughout that time who built it, who cultivated it. It meant something to our consumer. We had a stand. We had a stand for women's voices, and I think that if the creative founder continues that on when their heart is no longer in it, that's okay for a little while, but it's only going to decline. Like you can't, and to me that was the worst case scenario, because it's almost like you're running it into the ground just because, and I think that's very selfish. So I think for me, to honor that legacy of that 15 years and what we had created and what it meant to people, to me that meant closing it and honoring it that way. And I know that I did a talk with American Express not long after I made the decision, and this gentleman stood up in the audience and he said, I just don't understand, there's no logic behind what you're saying. If it's if it's in growth and it was all these things that you say it was, why wouldn't you give it to someone else, sell it, to carry on that legacy? And I turned to him and I said, sir, we're talking about legacy we're both right. Like you're talking about legacy in a financial way, I'm talking about legacy in a brand way. And
did he have a business named after him? Probably not.
I didn't get to ask him. I didn't know, he was in the back of the audience, about 500 people in the audience, and and this answer just came to him, and it was almost an answer for myself as well, where I'm like, because I think to drive it into the ground is the saddest thing that could have happened.
100%. How did your team respond actually, first of all, how did you take them through the decision, and then what was their response?
That was completely to Jeff's credit. I was, obviously quite emotional about it. It was such a big decision for me, and it was a big to tell them that essentially, you no longer have a job because I've made this very selfish decision, but here's why I had to make it. And Jeff put in an incredible program where, you know, if people stayed till the next day, or because we did a 6-month closure. We didn't want it to be a funeral of the brand. We wanted it to be a celebration. And so we remunerated everyone above and beyond what we needed to. We made sure we tapped into every personal contact that Jeff and I had to get everyone placed into new positions. And that was, Jeff drove that program entirely. And I think he wanted to remove me from a lot of the logistics of it because, you know, when you're telling someone that the company that they work for is closing, there's so much, I would have delivered that with way too much
100%.
emotion. So Jeff, you know, being the very pragmatic person, he was like, okay, now here's what it means for you, and kind of took them through that process. And then I came in after that announcement and explained the emotional side of it. Yeah.
I think one of the main takeaways I take from that is there are always hard decisions to make in business. Every business would have had to make hard decisions last year.
Yep.
There's always hard decisions, whether it's because the business isn't performing or something changes, but it's how you go through those hard decisions with your team and the care that you give them that means you come out the other side either everyone thankful for the attention you gave it or upset and disappointed. And it sounds like you took the higher road, for sure.
And I think we've always prided ourselves on our culture and how when someone leaves your company, that's the health of your company. How people talk about your company after they leave.
Yeah.
And it was so integral that we hired people of like-minded values, that we treated everyone with the utmost respect, and I'm really proud of the way that happened.
Great. Yeah. Well done. So now and into the future. So obviously the book's just come out.
Yep.
The response has been fantastic, so that's excellent.
Thank you.
What are you focusing on now?
So, you know, I always say I've been first and foremost a storyteller. You know, jewellery was the vehicle, but, you know, jewellery wasn't my one true love. It was creativity and telling stories in a way. So that was through jewellery, that was through campaigns. Now it's through the traditional format of, you know, the book. I also have a foundation which was designed to empower women in business. It's now, the tagline has evolved now to for creative entrepreneurs, and kind of handing over that logistic framework of the tangibility of business. So if the book is the story, it's like, all right, well, here's here's our marketing template, here's all these documents, here's our supply chain, here's all these things, here's the network of contractors that I use, and kind of helping young entrepreneurs. And when I say young, I mean young in the journey, it's not an age, young at heart. And really supporting other entrepreneurs, because I think there's a responsibility when you've walked a path to turn around and help others who want to walk it too. 100%,
because even those that make it will eventually learn the lessons. Some won't actually learn them in time and not make it. And so there is a responsibility for us that have been there, build a business, say like, here's some of the stuff we've learned, and hopefully you don't make the same mistakes as we did.
You know, we can't really learn from other people's mistakes, but I think when we share our stories and we share them with that true vulnerability and honesty, that people can at least anticipate that something might be coming up. And I think anticipation is such a big thing that we don't do in business.
Yeah.
We often, you know, just in the task we're in, but to anticipate is the key.
Yeah, so maybe they haven't quite learnt the lesson, but when it is happening to them, they're like, wait a minute. I think I know what's going on.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Samantha, we've got a couple more questions that I haven't seen, you haven't seen. We call Make It Happen in a Minute.
Okay.
Ish is my addition to this.
All right.
So we just go reasonably quick. I very often interject and make it go for longer.
Okay, good.
Not
I'm a
too
bit
much
nervous.
pressure.
All right.
No. They're all great questions put together by Anna. All right. First question is, you had a cult followed brand and business. Is there any brand that you're a cult follower of currently?
I would say I'm a cult follower of the Taylor Swift brand. I'm not a Swiftie, but I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan. The music aside, but I mean, I love her music, obviously, but the way that she builds her brand, her creativity, her fan engagement, just, Team TS.
As soon as this episode is out, there will be many people in this office cheering for that
answer.
Good.
I didn't know what you were going to say then. I was like, good.
No, I can see Anna's over the moon right now. Lockie, maybe not so much. But if your business was still operating today, the jewellery business, who would you love to see wearing your jewellery?
I would say Taylor Swift, but she's already worn it. So I will say Michelle Obama.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. And why Michelle?
I just think she's incredible. Her integrity, she's just a powerhouse. I adore her.
Yeah, great. Question number 3. What fashion trend do you think needs to be brought back in?
Oh, That's usually like what one never needs to come back. I'm going to have
you
to.
You can tell us that one. What should never come back?
Well, I feel like the 90s are coming back in, and I'm like the low rider jeans. Like I'm nervous for that to revisit us. So.
90s is definitely back in. Our last event that we ran had a very strong 90s theme, and it was great.
I think it's scary when you've lived the trend and it comes back in. You're like, that's when you're like.
Unfortunately, that's going to happen more and more often for us. All right, so I think the 90s should be brought back. You're on the other side of the fence. That's a good answer. All right. If you could sum it up in one sentence, what legacy would you want to leave on the world?
I would like to leave the legacy to work to our own frameworks, to not have to feel that we're, especially as women, I feel like often we take on other people's frameworks of society or our parents or, things. And it's like, all right, you have to get married at this age, have kids at this age and do this with your business. I'm like, no, what's your framework and live true to that.
Yeah. So how does someone go about identifying what their framework should be?
Well, I think it comes back to intuition, which is a word that's, we've long known what it means. But when it's like, well, how's your body communicating with you? Like if something doesn't feel right to you, where in your body, is it a gut feeling? And, so often we push that down. And especially in business, we're taught to go into the logical side of the brain. It's like, well, if something doesn't feel right to you, there's probably a reason for that. And we might be measuring ourselves off. And we're in a time of perceived perfection. We're on Instagram, we're seeing what other people are doing with their businesses. Like, well, should I be doing that? It's like, well, that's what's meant for you is meant for you, and finding that framework. And I think that goes back to listening to what is meant for you. Yeah.
So maybe tune out some of that external noise. Listening internally and decide based on that.
Yeah, and I talk about the feeling filter and the thinking filter. Again, like going back to that feeling filter is not going to lead you astray. Yep.
Excellent. Final question. If an entrepreneur is dealing with imposter syndrome and needs to overcome it, what's the one thing they should do to make that happen?
Well, at this point in my career, and I actually give imposter syndrome a character in my book. It's that prevalent in my life. I personify imposter syndrome. I don't ever think it goes away personally. I think it's something that I've tried to learn to live alongside rather than, I spent so long trying to fight it and beat it. It was exhausting and it just continued to come back. So I'm like, all right, I see you. I acknowledge you. Give me 10 minutes to get this done. Give me an hour to do this podcast. And, kind of taking those moments and separating fact from fiction, because I think when we sit with imposter syndrome and that narrative goes into a vortex quite quickly, it's like, all right, be the adult. So, I'm 39 years old and sometimes I'm like, I'm just going to wait for an adult to tell me what to do. It's like, no, you are the adult in this situation. Like stop that conversation and interrupt it. Yeah.
So recognize it, it'll be there, but try and put it aside as much as possible.
Yeah, and put a stop to it when it starts to spiral, because it spirals really quick.
Yep. Great advice.
Yep.
Samantha Wills, this has been awesome. We've covered a lot of ground. Thank you for sharing your journey, your story, a lot of inspirational stuff for all of our listeners. So thank you very much.
It's a treat to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Make It Happen show. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And it doesn't need to end there. We've actually gone and grabbed a whole bunch of extra resources for you. Behind the scenes footage, videos from this and all the other episodes, as well as show notes that you can grab for free. Just head along to www.the-entourage.com/podcast and you can grab all those extra resources. Thanks for tuning in, and I cannot wait to introduce you to our next guest on the next episode.